But it's also relevant to the period we're studying, right? So the book's on the 1920s and 30s, and I'll say a little bit about what else when we come to that slide. But I need to jump into it. This being the period I research, I have to decide what I'm not going to say in this lecture because it's too much for my head. So I'll try to move through here smoothly. Another photo essay. The 1920s and 30s. Let's start with this idea. Nationalism. Just a few minutes here. I don't want to go into too much detail here. Remember we talked about nation building? That was the 19th century, right? Trying to construct a national identity using the power of the state, the tools of the state, right? To make people think of themselves as Mexicans, not as Oaxacans or not as people from Sonora or Chihuahua, but first and foremost as Mexicans. Nationalism is going to be the strongest political force to come out of the revolution. It's going to be the strongest political force. And nationalism, it has different kind of meanings in different countries. Europe, when we think about nationalism, we think of like Nazi Germany, right? It has a kind of a negative connotation to it, nationalism. In the US, you've probably heard in the political debate this new thing, white nationalism in the United States. That has a negative connotation to it as well. I'm going to argue, however, that nationalism in Mexico was a positive force. It was a cohesive, positive force in Mexican society. And nationalism, just kind of a very brief definition of it. Nationalism is when you identify first and foremost with your country. But it's a little bit more than that. Nationalism is going a step further and saying, let's say I'm a Mexican nationalist. What is Mexican is better than what is not Mexican, right? Mexican food is better than American food, right? It's true. Mexican music, for example, is better than non-Mexican music, right? A nationalist would say that. Mexican history is as glorious as any other country, be it Greece or Rome or China, Iran. Mexico's is just as deep and glorious as all those other countries. Those are nationalistic views.
How much of it has to do with like race or blood or, because it's like a mix?
Right. In the case of Mexico, I'm going to argue nationalism was inclusive of the different races. In opposition to, say, Europe, right, which was exclusive of anybody but the German race, right? I'll get that at the end. Just get that there. So, kind of two forms of nationalism we're going to talk about. First, I want to show you cultural nationalism, which I kind of just discussed a little bit, and then as we get into the main part of the lecture, we'll talk about economic nationalism. And here's a Diego Rivera painting. It's part of a mural, actually. And this is depicting Mexican history. This is the 1920s. And this was a new way of thinking about Mexican history. What's going on in this? A lot's going on in this mural. What's going on? How's it portraying the conquest? This is what it's doing. It's portraying the conquest of Mexico. Extortion. Yeah, extortion, slavery, right? Yeah. There's lynchings of the natives in the background. This is supposed to be Cortez. He's got kind of a deformed, evil-looking face. Looks like there's exchanges of money here.
What's his name?
Malinche, right here. Looks like, yeah. With the blue-eyed baby, Cortez's baby. They're torturing somebody, like a native right here. This is depicting a nationalist way of looking at the Spanish conquest, because Mexicans had never thought about the Spanish conquest this way. This is showing the Spaniards as the oppressor, right? Spaniards came, they conquered, they pillaged, and they extracted wealth, and they oppressed the natives in the meantime. Mexicans had never thought about the conquest in that regard. First of all, the Spaniards had promoted, right, the positive of the conquest, bringing Christianity and civilization. So this was something new. And a lot of Diego Rivera's paintings, they're very nationalistic. And these murals, by the way, they were put up on big public buildings. And the idea was, most people were illiterate still in Mexico at this time. So the idea was they could learn Mexican history just by looking at the images without reading. I'll give you another example of nationalism. And this one's Diego's wife. It's the famous Frida Kahlo. Yeah. This one embodies nationalist sentiment as well. And this one's called Two Fridas. She always did self-portraits. And, she had a pretty wild relationship with Diego Rivera. The stuff of novels, right? Their love relationship. And here she is. And this is the Mexican Frida wearing a Mexican dress and a colorful one. And this is the European Frida wearing the European dress. And Diego, her husband, being a nationalist, he always preferred the Frida, the Mexican Frida, in the traditional Mexican costume, not the European Frida. And you can kind of see that going on here, right? This is, by the way, she's holding a little boyhood image of Diego, suggesting like their love runs deeper than, say, just your normal relationship. But yeah, she has a whole heart. The Mexican Frida has a whole heart, right? Whereas the European Frida, who's not loved as much by her husband, right, has the broken heart, right? That's bleeding right there. Looks like there's some storm clouds in the background, right? This struggle for an identity, you can kind of going on in the painting. But you see how that kind of represents nationalism? Right? This is cultural nationalism. The Mexican costume is better than the foreign costume. This is one of the strongest political forces, and it's going to be a cohesive force, meaning people on both the right and the left are going to subscribe to Mexican nationalism. It's going to bring different forces together. So it's not an exclusive force like Europe, right? And also, to get back to race, nationalism was used, right? The mestizo becomes the kind of the symbol of the heart and soul of the nation. And Mexican nationalism is inclusive of all races. And the Indian, the mestizo, and particularly the mestizo, right? That was the new race from the conquest. So it's an inclusive force, not like European nationalism, which genocide, mass killings, and so it's different. It depends on where you look, right? Which society you look at, you'll find different characteristics of nationalism. We're going to talk about economic nationalism.
Example, after World War II, all over Europe, you used to put flags everywhere. I remember back then. In the late 25 years, we made one flag.
Right, yeah.
So it's getting, we were afraid of nationalism.
Afraid of nationalism in Europe. Yeah, I sensed that when I lived there too. Yeah, they're always like, why are Americans like worship their flag and stand up and say the
All the time here, it's just steady.
It's because in Europe they went to the far extremes of nationalism. Yeah, about to destroy themselves. So. Okay, let's get into Mexico, 1920. We left off here with the Sonorans. They were the winners of the revolution. The Sonorans, all led by Obregón, come to power in 1920. Ever since 1920, there's been a peaceful transition of power, political stability in Mexico. Different from other Latin American countries. But let me say a few words about the Sonorans here.
They were liberals.
No, they're nationalist. They're not liberals. Liberalism is dying in Mexico. People become disillusioned with liberalism. Nationalism is rising in its place. Sonora borders Arizona, far northwestern state. And what's kind of interesting about them, Sonora is completely different from central Mexico. And when they come to, because they're going to come and live in Mexico City, where they're going to rule the nation, they're going to encounter a different country in central Mexico than what they're used to in the north. And when they assumed power in 1920, kind of like the same old story. There's no money in the treasury, right? The economy's been devastated the last 10 years. So they're going to reconstruct the state, rebuild the state and society, and they're going to have a long-lasting influence on Mexico's political system.
So they are for the federal state, a strong federal state.
They want to centralize power in Mexico City. Yeah. Kind of like Porfirio Diaz. Similarities. Differences as well, but some similarities. Some more characteristics of them. So they're nationalistic. They're also very business-minded. They looked to, in California in the 1920s was booming, the Californian economy. And they wanted to replicate, like they looked to California as the model for economic development. Those big agribusiness farms, So they're business-minded, they're nationalistic, they're also very secular. Meaning they're not very religious. Because in the north, the church is not as strong, particularly in Sonora. It was a frontier society. And so the church did not have a strong influence over people's daily lives. So they're quite secular. The Sonorans are. And two big themes that are kind of talking about here: political centralization and building institutions, right? Institutionalizing the revolution. Let's jump into it. So there's Obregón without his arm. I told you how he lost his arm, right? The battles with Villa, lost the arm, was blown off, and he went to commit suicide. Yeah, the gun had not been loaded by his boy cleaned his pistol, so he lived to become president several years later. And he's president from 1920 to 24, Álvaro Obregón. And a few words about Obregón here. Obregón, I guess probably the best way to describe him, he's very pragmatic. You know what that means? Be pragmatic. It's like to be cautious, particularly if somebody in power. He's not an ideologue, meaning he doesn't have an ideology that he never strays from. He kind of deals with the circumstances and the situations as they come to him. He's just pragmatic. And one way that he was pragmatic was that the economy, 1920, there's not enough food for the country. And he fears that if you carry out a rapid, massive land reform across the country, that will hurt food production even more. So the numbers of land reform during his 4 years are not that great. Only about 3 million acres of lands were redistributed, meaning taken from the haciendas and given to the villages. Only about 3 million. And they were very selective. He being the pragmatic person he was, he only carries out land reform where there had been serious agrarian upheaval. The most intense agrarian upheaval. And one of those places was Morelos. I'll talk about Morelos in just a second. So Morelos carries out the first land reform in the 1920s and 30s. I'll come to you in a second. And the Zapatistas support him for this, right? He says, support my government in the 1920 election, and you guys can carry out your land reform. And they do. They start carrying really quickly. That's what the book's about. And question of the oil, too. Because remember, the Constitution says the oil belongs to the Mexican nation, the subsoils do. So there's a lot of pressure on him to implement the Constitution, but the United States is putting a lot of pressure on him not to take over the oil industry. And he doesn't, because he doesn't want to provoke a U.S. intervention. He fears the U.S. intervention. So he doesn't go after the oil industry, being pragmatic as he was. One of probably the most notable things he did was he started to professionalize the Army. The Army was massive, 500 generals. That's a lot of generals. And he starts to professionalize the Army. Right? He had a revolutionary army full of caudillos, and he's starting to turn it into a modern professional army that will back him. One way he does this, the caudillos, right? There's a caudillo in Morelos, there's one in one region in Oaxaca, another one in the other region in Oaxaca. They're all over the country. And what he does is he incorporates them all into the federal army, and he moves the generals around. He removes them from their power base. So the one in Morelos, Genoveva de la O, after 4 years in Morelos, he moves them to Tlaxcala. So you separate the caudillo from his loyal troops. And this was the way that he started to control the army. Because that was the big fear, was that the army would like the last 10 years, continue to overthrow governments. The point I forgot to mention about the Sonoran, they got 3 pillars to the regime, right? Three bases of support for the government. One is the army. Another is the peasantry. And another is the urban workers. So the army, peasantry, and urban workers. Those are the three pillars of the regime. And these guys, by the way, in the 1920s, above all, they just want to stay in power because the country was mobilized. And it wasn't clear that they were going to be able to hold power, but indeed they do. Obregon himself he's not corrupt, but he allows the generals around him to enrich themselves. And it was very common for revolutionary generals to become businessmen in the 1920s. So the land reform in Morelos. By the end of the decade, 80% of the peasantry would be working land. They would have their own land in Morelos. 80% by the end of the 1920s. And so I guess I'll just tell you a little bit about the book here. Zapata, of course, had been killed in 1919. These guys, they support Obregon. And so I did my research on this. Everybody had studied Zapata and what came before, and the causes of the revolution, but nobody had really looked at the aftermath. What happened in Morelos after the revolution? And so that's where my idea came actually when I was an undergrad. And here's what I found. As you can tell from their slogan, as you know, was land and liberty. Tierra y libertad. What I found in my own research, so I started looking at tens of thousands of documents from these villages during this period. And there was enough land to go around for everyone because the population had decreased so much during the revolution. And what they were really fighting over was water for these villages. That's hence the title of the book, right? Land, Liberty, and Water. And this was significant for various reasons because you need water for commercial agriculture. A lot of the studies of Zapata, they made it sound like these guys fought a revolution so that they could go back to their village and grow corn and be left alone for eternity. That was kind of the message when you read all these books about Zapata. Right? They just wanted to be left alone and nobody would bother them. They could just grow corn. But I found, right, they're actually going after the water so they could grow rice because you need a lot of water. You got to flood rice paddies. And rice is a commercial crop in Mexico. So they were growing it for the market, right? So they were engaging in the market. So this was some of the significance of the water findings. And man, it was a hot mess, the issue with the water, because it all came down off the mountains. And so the villages that are in the higher elevation and the lower ones, they would stop the water from going down to the lower elevation communities, right? So they could grow more rice, in other words. And then the lower elevation community gets upset, right? So they'll have a meeting with the other village, and then there'll be like a little pitched battle between the communities. And this kind of happens in all revolutions, right? Once the revolutionaries win and they defeat the old order, then they start kind of struggling against each other for power. But they remain loyal out throughout the 20s and 30s. Actually, they mobilized in their militias to go defend the government when there's a rebellion. So, if I ask you on the final exam, what were the Zapatistas fighting for? You can say land and liberty, and you will be correct. But if you want to give a really strong answer, you say the latest research reveals that the Zapatistas were fighting not only for land and liberty, but also for land, liberty, and water. There you go. So don't forget that. I'll put a big check. Final exam.
The rice itself is not original from Mexico.
It's not. It's from Asia. But the rice that they're growing, it was the white rice. And the rice they're growing, though, it was the best in Mexico because it had to do with the soil and the elevation and the geography of Morelos. And have you ever heard of arroz Morelos in Mexico? You never seen a recipe? They always demand arroz Morelos.
Okay, who brings the rice to them?
The rice had been there since the Spanish conquest. Cortez. And that's the next book I'm going to write. History of rice in Mexico.
What was it? Their peasantry, army,
urban workers. Yeah.
See, so there was no oil bar, they bring rice to Mexico.
Yeah, and I do a little bit of culinary history in the book too about when does rice become a staple of the Mexican diet? It wasn't in this period. Rice was only consumed by the middle class. It was like a luxury item still, and it wouldn't be till after World War II till rice became a staple.
Speaking of food, I heard on the radio the other day and on some TV shows talking about tacos, and they're saying that they were the earliest mention of them was in the teens and 20s and 30s.
Tacos?
Yeah, pretty much tacos. And I remember how you said that the Olmec were making like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
masa to tortilla beforehand. It wasn't like a taco, but it was still the
Right.
same thing.
Same idea. Taco, all it is food between a tortilla.
Yeah, and then they were saying that the tortilla and more they point to the flour that it's like it's a thing from the Moors when they came over with the Spanish. That they're the ones that really invented it. I don't know if that's true or if it was already there and they're just trying to take credit, making it westernized.
The issue with food, and I found from the research on rice, is the Mexican diet, the culinary cookery is evolving throughout all this period, pretty much.
The pita and the flour tortilla are too similar to be coincidence. That the Jews brought some Jewish flowers, the Moors.
I'd have to look into all that.
Yeah, that
I'm
sounds
not
like
sure. The urban labor movement. Talk a few minutes about here. I actually kind of skim over the urban workers. But you remember, the revolution had been fought in the countryside, in the upheaval. But in the cities, the workers, they take advantage of the chaos around them, and they start organizing, going out on strike. And it was pretty militant. I mean, during the revolution, like working in a factory, sometimes the workers would just get upset with the boss and knife. That was it. It was pretty radical stuff. Obviously, Article 123 promised them an 8-hour workday, minimum wage, recognition of their union, the right to go out on strike. Those ideals are still being implemented into practice. But Obregón, he names union leaders into his government. And in particular, it's the urban workers who really benefit from the Sonorans, because they're in the cities, and that's where kind of the Sonorans are based in Mexico City. And here you can see, this is like, looks like some kind of labor demonstration going on, but you have top government officials joining the workers in the streets, backing them. And the workers, particularly if the factory is owned by foreigners, like if it's a textile factory owned by a French person in Puebla, the government, right, uses the labor movement as a way to attack foreign domination of the economy, right? We'll support strikes in the foreign-owned companies. That's a way to support the Mexican workers. And, violence, by the way, is still tapering off. There's a lot of political violence in the 20s, not like the 10s, for example. Villa's assassinated in 1923. If you remember, Obregón had promised Villa a hacienda, right, in 1920. Support my government, and you can have your hacienda. And you can form your military colony there, and it'll be all good. What happens, though, the presidential succession, the election in 1924 is coming up. This is always a big deal in Mexican history. That's why the election this summer will be a big deal. The election's coming up in 1994, and Obregón knows that the Sonorans are going to split. The Sonoran family, the dynasty as I call it here, they're going to split because number one, they're a large group, and there's always who's going to be next president. Like Obregón has his favorite, but there's another Sonoran who wants to be president. So this is what they split over, the presidential succession. So Obregón knows a rebellion's coming. He knows that the presidential succession is going to cause a rebellion within the Sonorans because they're not going to agree with his successor. Obregón also fears when the rebellion comes, Villa is probably going to join. So as a way to preempt that, we don't have direct evidence of Obregón giving the verbal order to carry out the assassination, but
Maybe you say that?
no, because what evidence we do have kind of points back to Obregón and Sonorans. He takes out Villa, preempted 1923. He was riding down the street eating ice cream, I believe. Villa was, and he was in Parral, Chihuahua, where he was gunned down. So here we go. Villa, 1923. Revolution's devouring leaders. This is a key term, Bucciarelli agreements. I want to go over it kind of quickly. This has to do with the context is the presidential elections coming, 1924. export. And the United States had still not recognized Obregon's government, meaning it didn't have official diplomatic recognition. Obregon could not take out loans from U.S. banks. He could not purchase arms from the United States. He needs this. He needs this bad because he knows the rebellion's coming at the end of the year. And how's he going to fight the rebellion without arms and money? So this is where the Bucciarelli agreements come in. These are agreements between the United States and Mexico, and it's over the question of the oil. Here's Obregon. There's Calles, I believe. This is, I believe, Ambassador Sheffield, who's a real hard ass. These were really tense negotiations. I know it looks like they're like having a drink and making a toast, but really tense negotiations. And here's how they concluded. In exchange for the United States recognizing Obregon's government, which in turn will allow Obregon to buy arms, to take out U.S. loans, here's what Obregon promises. He said that anyone could drill for oil, despite what the Constitution says. Right? The Constitution says the oil belongs to the Mexican nation. You can't even own private land below the subsoil. Right? Anything below the soil belongs to the Mexican nation, minerals and oil. Obregon's saying, we'll forget that part of the Constitution. The Americans can continue to exploit the oil. That was the first part. He also says that lands owned by Americans will not be expropriated, meaning they will not be taken over by the government. And he also says that Mexico would agree to pay the U.S. losses that Americans suffered during the Revolution. So Americans had properties during the Revolution. And their properties some of them were destroyed and damaged. Obregon saying Mexico will pay for those damages to the Americans. And lastly, he agreed that oil production taxes would be used to pay Mexico's debt. So the taxes that are collected from the foreign-owned oil companies, Obregon's saying, I'll take that tax money and I'll pay Mexico's debt to the United States with it. Yeah. This was on the newspaper the next day in Mexico City, and people couldn't believe it. It was seen as Obregon selling out to the foreigners, right? He's saying he's not going to implement the Constitution. Yeah. He's not going to implement the Constitution. They can continue to drill the oil. Don't worry about it. Just sell me money, or sell me guns, and provide me with weapons. Recognize my government. And that was the agreement. So that kind of he was a pragmatic. Remember being pragmatic? He's just kind of evolves with the situation. And an ideologue would say, no way, there's no way I'm going to bend to the foreigners. But him being pragmatic, he does so. And this was seen as a stunning victory for Washington. It's on the newspaper, and everybody can believe Obregon sold out to the foreigners. When the rebellion ends up coming in December 1923, and it only lasts till to the beginning of the year, January 1924. One of the Sonorans revolted. He had wanted to be president, and he took half the army with him. Half of the army this general takes with him in the revolt at the end of the year. Thanks to Obregon's loans and his ability to purchase arms, Obregon's able to put down the revolt. And this also helps him control the army because he purges all those generals who had revolted against him. So that gives Obregon more control over the army. All that makes sense? I know it's a little complicated, the Bucciarelli agreements, but it was about the oil and about how far Obregon would bend to the Americans' will. So his successor, Calles, is the one who assumes the presidency. Calles does. Calles is a really interesting figure. He's not a well-liked figure in Mexico today, and it's for two reasons. You'll hear Mexicans talk about Calles, and it's always in a very negative light. I actually say he was the one who was most responsible, actually, for bringing the Zapatistas the regime, but that's part of the book. 2 reasons why Mexicans are not too fond of him, at least some of them. Number one, he's going to be the one who's going to create this party here, and I'll go over this. The PRI, 1929. So he's associated as being the founder of the party. So people in Mexico who don't like the PRI tend to curse. Number 2, he's going to reignite the war with the church. He's going to be very anti-clerical. That's something I forgot to mention about Obregon. Obregon didn't provoke the church. Being pragmatic, he didn't want to, because he knew the church was a powerful force, so he didn't want to provoke the church into a conflict. And the church, by the way, is hostile to the government, because it's a revolutionary nationalist government. A few more words about Calles. He is going to be, he's kind of a shadowy figure as well. And in his government, he puts the union bosses in some of the head ministries. He puts the union bosses as the head of the economy, basically. And he's known, though, also as being a state builder. He created a lot of institutions in Mexico, that being the most famous or infamous, however you want to look at it, three. And so some of the things he does, he creates the Bank of Mexico, carries out tax reform, reduces the public debt, a lot of infrastructure projects as well he promotes. So road building. They will build big irrigation works as well in the north.
So this is always with the nationalist interest.
Yeah, yeah.
Is it irrigation work?
Irrigation works. They would build big dams, right, to bring water to fields that have never had it before, particularly in the north. And organized labor, in particular, grows in power under Calles. And on the agrarian question, Calles, you can see he doubles the amount of land that Obregon carried out, 8 million acres, Calles, but it's still quite selective. And it's just touching, specific regions where there had been a lot of mobilization, but not the entire country, not yet at least. So there's still a lot going on the countryside, you can imagine, because there's still a lot of landless peasants out there demanding land, confronting hacendados, foreigners as well. But what Calles is remembered for most is is him provoking the conflict with the church. And that's what the Calles law comes in right here, this last key term. So Calles is going to provoke the conflict with the church. Historians have debated forever. Why does he do this? Because it is going to dominate. I mean, it's going to be a 3-year war getting ready to erupt in 1926. And historians, it's really hard to explain because it's not like he wrote a diary why specifically he did this. But in general, the nationalistic revolutionaries, they tended to see the church as an anti-national institution. Where's the church's headquarters? In Rome, right? Not in Mexico City, right? So they see it as an anti-national institution. And they also think that the church keeps Mexicans backwards. That the beliefs that the church promotes, and that keeps Mexicans from becoming good modern citizens based in science and reason. That's how they're looking at it. This will become clear as we move forward here. Here's the Calles law. He announced this in 1926. Here's what it said. Calles law says all religious schools will be closed. And any church official who criticized the government would be jailed. All schools, all religious schools are going to be closed.
But there's only one Catholic, yeah?
Right. Well, there was some public schools. They start building. I'll talk about.
Well, I mean, the religion one is only Catholic.
Government-funded schools will be closed, or just in general?
Just Catholic schools will be closed. Yeah, the public schools will remain open because they don't teach Catholicism. So the Catholic schools will be closed. Anybody who criticizes, any church official who criticizes the government will be jailed. It outlawed religious orders. It closed down the religious orders. It also says that no political organization can have a religious name to it. And so what's going on is you have a lot of parties in Mexico, 8,000 in the 1920s, and some of them are Catholic parties. And these parties the state and the church start to compete against each other for Mexicans' loyalty. So you have Catholic parties, you have revolutionary parties. So he's saying with the Calles law, no political organization can bear a religious name. Large numbers of priests, foreign priests, were deported from Mexico. It's almost like the expulsion of the Jesuits. Church properties were seized. The remaining priests were forced to register with the government. So if you wanted to stay, you had to go register with the government. This image here, this is from a U.S. newspaper. Mexican Catholics waiting their turn to worship. Part of the throng that crowded into the Mexico City Cathedral in the days just before the government took it over. So the way the Catholic Church responds, the Archbishop calls a strike. A strike. He says the churches are going to close. That's what's going on here. They're going, this is at the Metropolitan Cathedral, these Catholics there going to Mass because they know the churches are closed, so they better receive communion and go to Mass before it closes. That's what they're doing there, waiting on their turn. And the Archbishop calls a strike, and the churches, they close the next day. They stay closed for 3 years, the churches do. So yeah, for the first time since the arrival of the Spaniards in 1519, Mass was not celebrated in Mexico. So 400 years almost. Oh, indeed 400 years, yeah.
So that was the decision of Rome to do that.
The Archbishop of Mexico. Yeah, that was their way of protesting the Calles law. Like, all right, we'll just shut them down. Nobody expected the churches to remain closed for 3 years. Now, there were masses still celebrated, but they were secret masses. Right? There's just no public masses are being held for 3 years, but there are a lot that are going on in secret. So this is July of 1926, and shortly afterwards, the Cristero War erupts. And it was going to 1926 to 29, and this is a major religious war. There's a little section on it in our textbook, the very short introduction. You definitely want to, if you're talking about the church and religion in your paper, I would definitely write at least a paragraph about Cristero. Catholic uprisings in 17 states, so not the entire country. 17 states, but it was particularly in the center-west states. Michoacán, Jalisco, Guanajuato. 80,000 are going to be killed. 200,000 are going to flee to the U.S. And it was a brutal, brutal war. It was the federal government fighting in these regions against the Catholic rebels. They were known as Cristeros. That's where the name comes from, Catholic rebels. This is a image of a secret mass in Michoacán. And you can see here they are, and they got their arms right at the Mass. And the day, 12th of December, 1928, what's the 12th of December? The day of the Virgin, that's right. Yeah. So this is a secret Mass that's going on. And this has been something that's kind of difficult for historians to explain. Number one, why these regions? Why not the rest of the country? Here's what we found out.
More weapons.
If you remember the Porfiriato, Diaz never made trouble with the church. So during the Porfiriato, those 35 years, the church actually starts to make a comeback because remember La Reforma and those laws had attacked the church. But during the Porfiriato, particularly in these states, the church makes a big comeback, building new churches, lots of wealth. And these are also known as very Catholic states as well, right, where the local priest plays a very influential role in the community. And so that explains, this Catholicism in this region was very much tied to the institutional church. Whereas if you look at like Catholicism in Chiapas, which is heavily indigenous, right, they have kind of a folk Catholicism that's not so tied to the institutional church. But here, Catholic culture was very much tied to the institution of the church, the official doctrines and theology. So it was strong. Catholic culture was very strong in these states, in other words. And but another part that's been difficult for historians to explain is a lot of these were peasants. They rose up against the government. How do you explain, how do you explain a revolutionary government is promising them land? Why would they revolt against a government that's promising them
Because
land?
their faith is stronger.
That could be one reason. Yeah, their faith is stronger. But the Zapatista militias, they supported the government in this.
Even they still believe.
Here's what we found.
You know, it's like the Italians.
What we found is that in the center west states, and particularly in these states, there was a very large ranching class, a large class of ranchers who already owned their own private land. These are not like the villages of central Mexico and the ejidos. These were ranchers in these states. You had a large ranching class. And they already own, right, maybe they have 50 acres for their family farm. And they fear the revolutionary government. They fear that the revolutionary government is going to take their land. And they see the revolutionary government also as being godless and atheistic, and they see this as a religious war. And it drags on for 3 years. You had the Pope, the U.S. ambassador, everybody trying to broker a negotiated settlement to this. And the government was really arrogant, thought that they could defeat the Cristeros in a matter of weeks and months. But that was not the case. And finally, in 1929, a settlement is reached. And it was pretty much a stalemate. Neither side was able to impose its will on the other. And here was the settlement. The churches would be allowed to reopen after 3 years of silence. Several bishops were allowed to, and priests were allowed to return to Mexico after an exile. Religious instruction was allowed in Catholic schools, but not in public schools. And the church also agreed to register all priests with the government. I've seen these files working in the 20s and 30s. It should be a file full of priests, and it has their photo and their address, right? So the government can keep tabs on it. Make sure, because the government sees them as being subversive. You ask a question?
Just the third one. What was the third one again?
Several bishops would be allowed to return from exile. Is that it?
No, the next one.
Religious instruction would be allowed in Catholic schools, but not in public schools. Also, the church agrees to register all priests. And also, priests were not allowed to wear their clerical garb in public for the remainder of the 20th century. Right? In the church, they could wear their clerical garb, but not in public.
Why?
Because they're seen as subversive, because they're hostile to the revolutionary government. And this is a way to control them, right? And a way to suppress Catholic culture.
So they can wear it now.
Now they can, because those reforms were passed in the 1990s, when
It's quite large. Mexico is the second most Catholic country in the world.
It is. Yeah, the Pope John Paul went and made more visits to Mexico than anywhere else. So Italy, of course. Always get too fast. So the war comes to an end in 1929. This is what broke the political power of the church. I mean, since then, the church has not had really any political power. It does to some degree whenever there's kind of like for instance, recently the issue of gay marriage has come up in Mexico. And the church organized protest against it, right, being hostile to gay marriage, being a conservative political force. So it's still, but not like it used to be involved in politics. 1928, the presidential succession is coming up again. It's in the middle of the Cristero War. And it was an issue. Obregón, he had gone back to Sonora, but he's sitting there watching the Cristero War from afar, and he's saying, like, the country's falling apart. I need to be president again, because the country's going to fall apart unless I save it. That's Obregón's mentality. But you remember, the Mexican Revolution had been fought over no re-election. So, and the Constitution said no re-election. So Obregón, he has to, and he gets Calles to go along with this. Calles didn't want to go along with it. They pressure congressmen and legislators to change the Constitution to allow for re-election. So Obregón can stand again in 1928. There's a lot of arm twisting and coercion to get the legislators to change the Constitution, but they do anyways. Obregon runs for the presidency in 1928. He wins in the summer of 1928. He wins. It's always July 1st. It's around this, like this summer. It's when the election will be up. He wins. Before he can assume the presidency later that year at the end of 1928, however, he's assassinated at La Bombilla restaurant in Mexico City. This is just moments before he was assassinated. The waiter shot him at point blank range. And the waiter was a cristero. He was a religious zealot, and this was his revenge. He got it on Obregon. But the irony is that Obregon was not the anti-clerical one. Yeah, it was Calles was the one who started the war against the church. Obregon was pragmatic and didn't want to provoke a fight
In the
with
30s?
the church. This is 1928.
I didn't read that.
1928. Obregon's assassinated. Here we go.
A lot of killing.
A lot of killing. This tells me that political violence was a legacy of the Mexican Revolution.
2000 was the first year nobody got killed, right?
When?
The year 2000.
I'm not sure. That was when the PRI fell. I'll mention that. So here's the so this caused a crisis. I mean, look at this. Madero 1913, Zapata 1919, Carranza 20, Villa 23. The revolutionary family was devouring itself. Right? These had all been revolutionaries, not counter-revolutionaries. And this creates a crisis because who was to blame for this? Some people were blaming Calles for this. He wasn't behind it. It was just kind of, that one-off kind of that waiter who was dead. And by the way, the waiters, of course, arrested, shot by firing squad shortly after this. The crisis is, if this keeps going on, we're all going to be next, right? This is going to be a long list of assassinations. And so Calles was the one who came up with the idea that a party needed to be created that would unite the revolutionary family. And the revolutionaries, they could resolve their conflicts within the party. Everybody would just keep their conflicts within the party. They would have primary elections, and that's how they would resolve their differences. Because if not, and there's a reading, you'll read about this, about Calles creating institutions. Calles wants to end the government of caudillos, create a government of institutions. So he creates it wasn't called the PRI in 1929, it was the PNR, but it was the grandfather of the PRI. They changed the names a few times. But there it is, you can tell it's about the Partido Nacional Revolucionario, a PNR. And he creates it in 1929 as a response. There had been 8,000 political parties in Mexico before this. So this is kind of the logic. Like, we need to unite everybody, the revolutionaries, into one party. If you're not a revolutionary, you're not welcome to the party. And at first, it was kind of like what you see here. It was just kind of political elites in the party. Like, living in Mexico City, congressmen, maybe some governors. But, down in the pueblos, still nobody's a member of the PRI yet. They're going to become them. In fact, Morelos, in my study, Morelos, all the villagers become priistas. They all join the party because the party had given them land. The party's represents a revolutionary government. But the masses still are not incorporated into the party. That's going to be one of the themes of the 1930s. Yes?
So I know I've seen that when I was little, I would go to Mexico and see that like on the walls and stuff. But they also have PAN, right? PAN.
Yes, the PAN. That was created in the 1930s.
Oh.
That was, so there's the PRI. Another one of the main political parties in Mexico is the Party of National Action. This is the kind of the conservative party. At first it was a Catholic, mainly just Catholics who didn't want to be priests, right? So they're members of that comes from the 30s. The PAN is going to remain in loyal opposition throughout the remainder of the century, right? Loyal to the PRI, and the PRI will be like, all right, you can have one Congress seat. That's it. No governorships, but you can have a seat in Congress. Maybe one or two. We'll come back to the PAN. Yeah.
if I'm right, isn't the PRI now, they're like the elite conservative, wealthy,
The PRI is all things to all men. It can be left one minute, it can be right one minute, it can change. Kind of the centrist party, meaning you can kind of go other way whenever as the circumstances dictate. I'll say more about the current politics next week. So this is created in 1929, and the Maximato, you can cross this one out on your outline. I'm not going to make you know this one. One time I asked it, nobody got it right. The Maximato, these years, 24 to 28, Calles is no longer president, right? Can't stand for re-election. Obregon's assassination decided that. He still wants to rule, and so the Maximato is known as Calles is still ruling, but not from the presidential seat. He's ruling from the shadows. He was referred to as the Jefe Maximo, the chief boss of the revolution. So that's why this period became known as the Maximato, because he's the Jefe Maximo. And he has three puppet presidents, one from 28 to 30, another from 30 to 32, and another from 32 to 34. You don't need to know their names. Just know he was the one calling the shots. A few characteristics. The Maximato, quite conservative, the Maximato was. He becomes, they actually become quite disillusioned with land reform. And they stop land reform in 1929. Completely stops it, pretty much. And here he is, and I found this one in the, this was in the archive. El Nacional, this was the official paper of the PRI at the time. And so I was just in the archive flipping through this, and I found Calles in Cuernavaca. He was in Morelos. He had a home in Cuernavaca because it's only about 90 minutes away from Mexico City. So all that, this is a good example. He's in Cuernavaca most of the time in his home. And instead of all the politicians going to Mexico City to talk to the president, they would go to Cuernavaca and meet with Calles, right? And that's kind of what's going on here, right? Governors and diputados and senators, and all going to meet Calles in Cuernavaca. The Maximato. Quite conservative, the Maximato was. And Calles is ruling from the shadows. So Calles is actually in power 10 years, 24 to 34. His presidency is 24 to 38, and then the Maximato is 28 to 34. Cardenas, the 1934 presidential election. Calles, he picks Cardenas. Calles was controlling everything by this point. Another reason why many Mexicans are not too fond of him nowadays. Calles thought he could control Cardenas. He thought, but that did not end up being the case. What happens is, now I'll say a little bit about Cardenas here in a few minutes. 1934 and 35, there's this massive power struggle between Cardenas, the president, and Calles, the Jefe Maximo. And everybody in the country lines up. Who you with, Cardenas or Calles? The left is going with Cardenas, and the more conservatives are going with Calles. And Cardenas wins this battle by 1935, and he actually exiles Calles. Calles goes to Los Angeles. He doesn't join this list, which is good. Now we know the era of Caudillos is coming to an end. And so Calles is exiled after this national power struggle. And he's going to come back. He's going to be allowed to come back 10 years later. He's in LA in the meantime. And so Cardenas takes over. And Cardenas would have a very profound influence on Mexico's political and economic system. A few words about Cardenas. He was from the state of Michoacan. He was originally from Michoacan. And Cardenas is going to be known as the great performance president of 20th century Mexico. When he campaigned in 1934, it was almost reminiscent of Madero's 1910 campaign. Went to small villages, would go up into the mountains, the communities, would get on a horseback and cross the river with his entourage to go visit an isolated village. Here he is during the revolution. They all fought during the revolution. If you didn't fight in the revolution, you were done, basically. That was when he was a teenager, and here he is in office. And Cardenas is going to accelerate change. what had happened in the early 1930s, the Great Depression, people thrown out of work, hard times, like it was in the U.S., hard times in Mexico also. And that tended to, when people are suffering and don't have enough food and not enough employment, they look for radical solutions, right? So society actually becomes more radicalized during the early 1930s as a result of the Great Depression. So they're calling on reforms. Man, this sends 8 million and 3 acres, that ain't enough. That's not enough. That's not going to cut it. We need more. Right? It's been, 1910, it's been 20 years since the revolution. He also represents kind of a new generation, a younger, more reformist generation coming to power. Land and labor reform. We'll start going over his stuff here. Land and labor reform. He would, the numbers speak for themselves. 49 million acres of lands he's going to redistribute. He's going to blow them out of the water when it comes to land reform. And that went to 750,000 rural families got land. 750,000 families got land. And it would be really dramatic. He would go to places where, like the Yucatan, where the old hacendados had dominated for decades. And he would just show up, the government, there'd be like, a few hundred people in the government show up. They'd be like, all right, we're going to go out to the Yucatan next weekend. They'd all show up, everybody in the government, they'd be coming to town, the revolutionaries. And it'd be really dramatic, right? All the people would come out, like you see here, to greet them. And they'd be carrying out signing land titles and giving them to the villagers. So let's look at some photos of all this at the end. And all over the country, he did this. In the Mexicali Valley, they expropriated American-owned properties, like taking foreign-owned properties and redistributing them to the landless villagers.
He's going to be guilty?
Well, no, he's not. No, he's not. Here's why. The international context is important.
Yeah, because
Who was president in the 1930s in the U.S.?
FDR.
FDR. Do you know what his policy was towards Latin America? What it was called? It's called the Good Neighbor Policy. The Good Neighbor Policy. Franklin Roosevelt knows, well, even before he sees World War II coming, he knows he needs better relations with Latin America. Because before this, we all know, invasion after invasion after invasion. Roosevelt wants to be good neighbors. And so he promises not to intervene in Latin American affairs. Not to intervene in Latin American affairs. And as the 30s wear on, Roosevelt knows he needs Latin America on the U.S. side with during World War II, because he doesn't want to lose all those resources in Latin America to the Germans. So the good neighbor policy is what allows a lot of these radical reforms to be carried out. And the U.S. is not even protesting this. There might be obviously some individuals, but the president and the government are not like, we're going to invade if you take those lands. That was the context. There was good relations between the U.S. Good neighbors in the 1930s. Go over World War II next week very briefly. So land and labor reform. And here's what happens. This is when the party starts becoming the party of the masses. Because he shows up to your village, carries out the land reform, gives the community his land titles, and of course they're gonna be very supportive of the government, right? Could you imagine? Right? Finally, the government's on our side supporting us. And so they join the party. This is when the party becomes the party of the masses, during the Cardenas years. They become members of the party, all these two. And, there were strings attached.
I had a question. You said 750,000 families or just 700?
Families. 750,000.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
49 million acres.
How much?
65 and 30 acres.
Pretty good. Yeah. Good math. But there was strings attached. Like, for instance, we're going to give you an ejido in your community. Join the party, and if you need credit, you're going to have to get it from the government. Right? If you need credit, And they're offering to support the countryside with credit. And things were pretty good in the 1930s, but the way land reform is being carried out, it's setting up the future so that the peasantry is going to be dependent on the state for resources. That's what's going to happen with the ejido. There's a reading that covers this week. Is that picture? I'm not sure exactly. Somewhere there in the north, but I got it from the AGN.
The land they don't distribute, they have survey, the guys.
Yeah, they show up, survey the lands, right,
Oh,
with
they
their
do?
surveyors. Yeah, they did it the right way. Yeah, there was a lot of conflicts, but
So who's getting what?
the community gets the ejido, and the ejido is tied to the national government. So before the revolution, the ejido was just the community, no ties to the government whatsoever. But after the revolution, the ejido is tied to the national government for resources. Like when there's an election in the ejido, they just send the results to the national leaders, and usually it's just ratified. But it's being set. Cardenas doesn't, he didn't do this. He had good intentions, but the system's being set up so that once the government becomes stronger, it's going to be able to control the peasantry through the ejido. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week. But for the 30s, this is the heyday of land reform. And likewise with labor reform, kind of like what I had mentioned with Obregón. Workers go out on strike, Cardenas will back them, right? Particularly if it's against a foreign company. I'll talk about oil and labor in a sec. Rural education. And this very much ties into the theme of nationalism. They built schools in the 20s and 30s, built thousands of them across the country. And they're rural schools, and they're federal rural schools. So, we all, in the U.S., we all go to state school, public schools, right? There are no really federal public primary system, but they created one in Mexico because the federal government had more resources, right? And this is kind of a national project here. And Morelos was the first place they built them. And Morelos, they loved the schools. The only thing they didn't like the boys and girls sitting beside each other in classrooms. So they didn't like co-education. Parents did not like that. Huh?
Did you like mixed school?
So this one's in Coahuila, in Torreon. And here's the children. And it's really fascinating to read about education. They were promoting nationalism in the schools. I've looked at a lot of documents from education, and one really fascinating one is there'd be inspectors that would go from school to school to school all over the villages. They would have these standardized forms. They would just fill them out. And it would be like, does the classroom have a Mexican flag? Yes or no? Check. Do the students speak Spanish? Yes or no? Check. Do the students know who Benito Juarez is? Do the students know who Miguel Hidalgo is, right? Because good, patriotic young Mexicans would know those, of course. So they're promoting nationalism in the schools. And Cardenas actually, anti-clericalism goes on into the 1930s, and particularly in the classrooms. These teachers show up from the cities, and they'll show up in the village, and they'll start teaching anti-clericalism. And it's part of the curriculum. Yeah, speaking out against the local priests in the church, and that caused a lot of conflict. Some of these teachers were killed by local parents. And finally, though, Cardenas figures out they need to roll back anti-clericalism in 1936. So they stopped teaching anti-clericalism in the classrooms because attendance had gone down. People just kept their children out of the classrooms. And once they reform the curriculum, then the attendance goes back up. So anti-clericalism kind of drags on actually until the 1940s, but in the streets, in the villages, it's no longer like a big.
But it was mandatory school?
It was what?
They have to go to school?
Yes, they had to go to school. And that would be part of the survey. How many children in the village are in the classroom? Right? There's 25 children in the village, only 12 of them in the classroom? Not good. Yeah, most of the time, though, they would be out in the fields helping their parents grow rice.
In Texas.
Women's suffrage. Let's briefly do this, because I'm running out of time here.
More
The issue of women's right to vote was front and center by the mid-1930s. When did U.S. women get the right to vote? What year?
1920.
20. Was
19th Amendment, yeah.
Yeah, that was the amendment. So it was on the political agenda in Mexico, and there had been a feminist movement in Mexico that began during the revolution. And Cardenas was behind it. And he was supporting women's right to vote, but he couldn't get Congress on board. Congress would not support women's right to vote. You know what their argument was? That if you gave women the right to vote, they would turn around and vote for the Catholic candidates, the Catholic parties. Because there was this belief that women were always under the influence of the local priest. They do whatever he says to do. That was the argument.
When it got into.
So Cardenas was behind it, but it died in Congress. Now, there were some states, a few states where women could get the right to vote, but at the federal level, it wasn't until 1953. Super late. Yeah.
But France was not touching it either.
Really?
I'm surprised.
I think Italy was the first.
England.
It was England?
I
Italy
know,
in the
England.
1880s. Anyways.
Australia before. Interesting.
Now, so, limits of the Mexican Revolution, we could say, right? Mexican Revolution did not destroy patriarchy, we could say. However, that does not mean that women's lives did not change.
Women fought right in the war.
Yeah, soldaderas. So, at the top, no official federal right to vote for women. But what did change, particularly for country women, mechanized corn mills start to appear in the countryside. Molinos, yeah. So these are, remember before you would grind the corn by hand. 2,500 years when they do that. The corn mills start showing up, and the government